Kayleigh McEnany, great to see you.
Good to see you, David.
I'll tell you what, you're drinking out of a fire hose a little bit. How's it been so far for you?
Oh, you know what? It's been a lot of fun. I talked to some of my predecessors in this job, and one of the things they said is you've got to always have fun to succeed in the job, and that's what we do. We have such a great team over at the White House, and certainly, you know, it's a lot of incoming, but nevertheless, when you've got a great team of people and a lot of prayer warriors out there, it makes it a little bit easier. So I'm just having the time of my life, and what an honor to serve President Trump.
I want to ask you a little bit that first press briefing, which I called on Twitter a home run, but there you were with the cross right front and center. I want to talk about your faith and how important that is to you. And what's that faith journey been like going back to Catholic school, all girls Catholic school?
Yes, all girls Catholic school. You know, people ask me what denomination I am, and I'm like, well, I went to Catholic school my whole life, but I was raised Southern Baptist, so I guess I'm Christian. But yeah, I grew up going to Catholic school, Catholic college, but born and raised Southern Baptist, and I consider myself an evangelical Christian. But faith is indispensable. You know, you mentioned that first press briefing. What you may not know is I was in panic mode right before, and I just got very nervous. We were very well prepared all night, all morning, all day. And then I closed the door, and my assistant, Lindy, who's a friend as well, can attest to the fact that I was just rattled and extremely nervous and feeling a lot of anxiety. And I called my mom, and on speakerphone, my family and I, we all prayed together. Lindy, who's a fellow Christian, sister in Christ, was there, and we just all prayed together. And all of a sudden, I took a deep breath, and after those prayers, it moved forward. I felt such strength, went in, talked to the president, and then walked out and did the job that only could be done if God was there helping you along the way.
Wow, that's fantastic. Speaking about your family, talk to me about them. I know you have a very close-knit family, and I'm just wondering, as a matter of fact, your father, a walk-on defensive lineman from Mississippi State. All right, we won't get into the Gators versus Mississippi State. Yeah. Maybe that's another interview. But I was reading a quote about how he talked about you and said you're a fighter. I mean, you're someone that is going to work their butt off, as they say in football language. Tell me about some of those lessons you learned from mom and dad.
Yeah, so my dad, as you mentioned, played football at Mississippi State. He was very small for his position of defensive end. He's not a small guy, but I mean, he is, for that position, was small at the time. And he says something to the effect of, it doesn't matter how small the dog is, it matters the fight in the dog. And that's a bulldog phrase. And he fought hard and made his way up to be a leader on that team and hold, I think it's the number 3 sacks record. And it was because he had a whole lot of passion and built a business from the ground up with basically nothing, just built it from scratch. And my mom was a big partner in that and has always been a woman of faith. And just seeing the two of them, the passion, the grounding in faith, and the constant instilling of those principles in us definitely was a big key to finding my way through the media world and the political world to being White House press secretary.
Talk to me a little bit about your faith as it relates to your family and Blake and your husband, kind of making sure your family kind of rooted in that faith. I know you said something along the lines of making sure your daughter and family are rooted, or at least follow the footsteps of Christ, and you feel like that's very important. Maybe expand on that.
Yeah, it's extremely important. You know, we all lead busy lives. My husband plays Major League Baseball, which means he travels everywhere. I, in my role, will be traveling to a lot of places, but it's a lot of hours. And my previous role with the campaign was always on the road. So we've had to have a family where a lot of people come in and help us. My mom is a big asset. You know, I was able to take my little tiny loved one, little Blake, my little daughter, all to Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, and she just traveled the state with me before COVID, the country with me before COVID hit. And my mom was a big asset in that, in the Trump campaign, and assisting and allowing me to be a working mom, literally a working mom, where my daughter came with me to these various elections and rallies and debates. And then now it's just a effort in progress, I should say, where we all chip in and help one another. But having faith through the center of our family is what makes all things work. You know, I believe God put me in this place for a purpose and for a reason, like he does with each and every life. We are all here for a reason, and achieving that purpose means making sacrifices sometimes, and sometimes that means family sacrifices. But I know at the end of the day, if I give Blake the same faith upbringing and relationship with Jesus Christ that my parents gave me, she will be an unstoppable woman of faith in whatever she decides to do.
What's that like? What's it been like, the balance between motherhood and working for this president in this White House. I mean, in these challenging times, the balance, I mean, do you need an Excedrin at times?
It is a balance, and I have a lot of help from my mom
Sure.
and from Sean's mom, my mother-in-law. But you know, it's unique because I remember distinctly when we were in, I believe it was Iowa. There was a plane that the campaign took home, and there were a bunch of senators and congressmen on the plane, and Don Jr. and Laura Trump was on the plane, and Brad, and there I was with my mom and my little baby, and praying she wouldn't scream. Not that anyone would have cared, but you know, I realized very quickly what this family, the Trump family, was all about. When they very quickly, Don was like, let me hold her, and Laura, no, let me hold her, and just they all stood, and Todd Ricketts, and just everyone who's you know, in this community stood up and was like, we're going to help you. You know, we see your mom struggling on this flight, and it was just great to see. And that's what this president is all about. You can see he's surrounded by his family, Ivanka and Jared, and these really great hard workers for the country. And he just embraces that all through how he treats people. I remember when he first called me about taking this job, he said, your husband's going to be on board with this, and you're going to be okay with your baby. And that was, he thought about my personal life and wanted to make sure that my family was going to be okay, and me accepting what is a very demanding role. And that makes all of this easier when you have a boss and a family that embraces your own family.
Yeah, for sure. Tim Murtaugh, I was reading, he talked about in the campaign how you would hold, or at least try to hold, Bible studies there at the campaign, at least however it was, virtually or maybe in person. Tell me about that. That's neat, these Bible studies that you were trying to keep going.
Yeah, we started that every Friday. It was a few weeks before or probably 2 months before I left the campaign to come here. My sister, Ryan McEnany, works on the campaign. My assistant, Lindy Rose, who's now with me here in the White House, who worked at the campaign as well, and another young woman named Sunny Joy Nelson. And the three of us came together and we said, you know, we represent so many Christians across this country. When I was at the campaign, obviously it's very evident the evangelical community has supported this president, so has the Catholic community and the faith community at large. And so we said, you know, to do that justice, we need to have prayer in this building, and we need to have Bible study and time in the Word. And so before work, we would all gather for about 45 minutes, and we'd do what we started to call popcorn prayer, where we would just pray out loud. And one of my good friends, who you know, Abigail Robertson, taught me this concept with the Bible study that she does. And it was just organic and spontaneous, and we would pray and read the Word, and it just gave a little pep in our step, because these days are demanding, they're challenging, they're long. In politics, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that's the nature of the job, and that just, I think it was a little rod of lightning of just energy and joy in our day, and it definitely transferred throughout the week. And so that Bible study still continues. I'm now at the White House. I'm not part of the campaign anymore, but it continues, and it's a very proud, I guess if you call it, leaving legacy that I left with the campaign, is having this moment of prayer and these incredible people who have continued that.
Talk about, you mentioned the word challenging, the double mastectomy, that you've been very public about, and for good reason. I think there's a lesson in that, especially as it relates to, I believe, gray socks and bright lemons. Yes. So tell me a little bit about that and your story and how you've come through that and what lessons came from that.
Yeah, so I was in college when my mom found out that she had the BRCA2 genetic mutation. And what that meant was that she had an 83% chance of breast cancer and a 20-something% chance of ovarian cancer. And it was over her lifetime. So she never got breast cancer. She never got ovarian cancer. But we did have 8 extended relatives who had breast cancer, some of whom died of it. So we found out about this genetic mutation. My mom was diagnosed with it, immediately decided to remove her breast tissue and her ovaries. It was very emotional and tough experience for her. And I was in college at the time at Georgetown University, and I decided I wanted to get tested because I saw that I was able to look at my mom and say she will never die of breast cancer because of this choice she made. Right. So I got tested in college, not really prepared for the results. And I remember waking up it was close to Christmas Eve. It was right around that time, and just crying because I got a call from the doctor saying, you have this genetic mutation. I didn't know what to do with it. And I remember my dad looking at me and saying, look, people in life don't always know what their physical ailment holds down the line. They don't know what their weakness is, but you know your weakness, and you know you have this, and you can attack it head on. And for 10 years, I just kind of delayed the process and got mammograms and was consistently monitored, but delayed it because I felt very strongly that it would be easier to go through if I had a soulmate and a partner in life to walk through that journey with me. And I found that in my husband husband, Sean. And about a year after we got married, I had a nipple-sparing mastectomy, and they removed my breast tissue. And I'm able to say today that I will never get breast cancer, or my chances are like 0.001% because of that choice. And I've had a husband that stayed with me every step of the way, and a new little baby, which is great. And, I just think it's so important for women to make the choice that's best for them, but to get monitored and to have faith to get you through it. Because as I said, you mentioned the lemons.
Yeah, the great socks.
Yeah, the socks that I wore on the day of my mastectomy had little lemons on them because I saw this beautiful moment in the movie This Is Us, and it was a doctor, and he was counseling parents who had just lost a child or went through some medical tragedy, and he said, when life hands you the sourest of lemons, turn them into the sweetest of lemonade. And I felt that day that's what I was doing, and because of my faith and Christ helping me through that moment, I think I made a good choice and can share that with other women.
And here you are today, White House Press Secretary.
Yes.
By the way, following in the footsteps of Stephanie Grisham, and then before that, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who also a very strong Christian. We know this. She got dinged in the media for it. You're getting dinged in the media for it. How are you handling those attacks? They've been fast and furious on you. And, you wonder if a strong conservative Christian supporting Donald Trump drives the media up a wall.
Yeah, no, that's right. And look, Sarah is a wise mentor. And in fact, that day when I was so nervous before the first press briefing, it was her text that helped me quite a lot in that moment, because she sent me a Jesus Calling devotional. And it was from, I forget if it was a year or 2 years, same day, but a year or 2 years prior, that day when she had done a press briefing and what that devotional was for her that day. So it really helped me and was very meaningful. But I think that's right. People are attacked for their faith, not just me, but Christian men and women across this country. It's unfortunate, but I think we found a real voice in President Trump, who stood for religious freedom and pro-life and given us this boldness. And it was at Harvard Law School when I felt attacked as a conservative and as a Christian that I realized it was that megaphone and that kind of boldness we needed and that kind of fighter we needed to represent the Christian community. And that's what we found in President Trump, and that's why it's an honor to work for him in this capacity.
Can I ask you a personal question about Robbie Zacharias passing away just in the last 24 hours or so? I know his teachings were so important to you, especially at Oxford. You've mentioned this. Can you tell me a little bit about what he meant to you personally and the loss for the Christian community?
Yeah, it's a huge loss. My dad said to me that Billy Graham was the great evangelist. And I think Robbie Zacharias is the great apologist.
Yeah. I know this is tough. I know. Yeah.
We don't have to cry because we're Christians, so we know it's about this.
Yeah, I mean, we're human the last time I checked. But the tears come from what? What was it that, because it feels like Oxford and your development of your faith.
Yeah, and Robbie's someone that I never met. I know his team, and I know some of those who are around him. But for me as a Christian, I always had the heart for Jesus Christ that I got at a very young age. I was saved when I was, in my teens. But to have someone who, from an academic place, as an apologist, could equip you with those arguments where you didn't have to check your brain at the door when you became a Christian, where there is intellectual foundation for everything we believe. Wow. There's prophecy, there's the human cell, there's the amazing creation of the human body and all of its complexity, and the planet, the universe. And he put a philosophical and academic rationale for the heart that I had for Christ, but gave me the ability to go to Oxford, where there are renowned atheist scholars who try to say there's no intellectual undergirding for Christianity. Robbie Zacharias, who happened to have an office at Oxford, was the person who provided the counter to that. The intelligence behind why we believe what we believe. And, your mind can never get you fully there. It's a place only your heart can take you. But Robbie Zacharias provided those steps to put in the minds of an academic, wow, I should give the Christian faith some thought. And, Robbie, he means so much. As I was saying earlier, Billy Graham was the great evangelist. Robbie Zacharias is the great apologist. And, I think the words that were at the very bottom of the announcement today of his passing are so important. He had a verse there and it said, "Because I live, you also will live." John 14:19. And they said that these 7 words changed Robbie's life 57 years ago. He was on a bed of suicide, as he described it. And it was a Bible that was handed to him, and those words in particular that set him on a 57-year path that has truly saved lives. I, on Sunday, watched a sermon knowing, Robbie was in a tough spot and was no longer getting treatment. So I had my daughter on my lap, and we were watching the sermon, of Robbie, and my husband was there, my mother-in-law was there. And it was a sermon about purpose, and it was a sermon about how every human life has a purpose. You are here for a reason. Every life matters, and it's about finding that purpose. And just hearing him speak and hearing those words was so meaningful. And it was in that sermon, I believe, where he shared the story of a CNN sportscaster who was living a profligate lifestyle and making bad decisions in life, but changed his life and found his purpose and found a family and became a Christian and got very sick. And when he was on his deathbed, the CNN sportscaster said that he was just really in search of God and really in search of finding Christ and hearing from Christ as he was about to leave behind his little daughter. And he said he saw a figure that is how he always imagined Jesus Christ would look like. And who he had pictured was Jesus, sat on the corner of his bed and said, "Tonight's not the night you will pass." And he had this distinct moment before he passed. And in watching Robbie describe that moment, knowing that he was probably in the next few days coming to his last moment, it changed me once again to hear that and to post the sermon on Twitter and have a user say, "Wow, I've never given Christianity a thought, but having watched what Robbie had to say, I may have to give Christianity a thought." So Robbie, his life may have ended, but his life continues, and in the next life, he is someone I'll meet in heaven, and rest assured his legacy will always be here, and he will continue to change lives.
What a loving tribute. Thank you for that. Before we get to some of the news of the day, I do want to ask you, you mentioned saved as a teenager. You said in your teens. What was that process like exactly? I don't know too much about that.
Yeah, so, my dad, it was, had always told me you've got to, find Jesus at the time that's right for you. And, I would listen to the sermons at church, and I walked down the aisle, and I became saved and gave my life to Christ. And I prayed with my dad, and I believe I became a Christian at that time in my life. But I believe I became a Christian in my teens, but it was later in life that I think my faith became even more real to me. I was going through a hard time in New York, and I was going to a great church in New York, and I remembered feeling very lonely. It was when I first started my young professional life. And I remember getting a call, and I never answered numbers I didn't know, but I answered that day, and it said, "Hey, this is the Journey Church. We feel like we need to pray for you right now. How can we pray for you?" And it was at a distinct moment that I needed to hear from Christ, and I felt that he communicated to me through my church. And it's that moment, I think my faith became even more real. But it's just all those times in our life, the hard times, the tough times, if you reach out, Christ always finds a way to reach back out to you when you truly beckon for him and call out to him. So those are some moments in my life that I think were really impactful.
Wow. As we transition a little bit, clearly God has impacted your life, and here's Donald Trump as president of the United States, and just proving God has a sense of humor, that Donald Trump is president. Who would have thunk it? But here he is. How do you see God kind of in all of that? This idea of providence and this idea that a lot of folks, I asked Sarah in that seat a few years back, that, is Donald Trump put there by God for such a time as this, if you will? What's kind of your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think, prayer made a difference in this election. And that's not to say, I think God not to say that he puts a certain political party in a certain place at a time, but I do believe certain people are meant to be in positions at a certain moment. And I do believe that President Trump is the person meant for this moment. And I think prayer made a lot of difference in the election. I'll never forget Laura Trump. I asked her, I was interviewing people for my book, and I said, what made the difference in the election? Without missing a beat, she said prayer.
Is that right?
And I think that's right. I think, that this country needed someone to fight for life, to fight for religious liberty. And I believe that President Trump was that person, and he's done that with the judges he's put in place, with the Mexico City policy ensuring federal dollars don't go to abortions, and mentioning religious liberty, and his UN speech was key. There's just so much that he's done to fight for the Christian community. So I certainly believe that he's here at this moment for a time, as we all are.
Some news of the day. items for you. The hydroxychloroquine. What do you know? I said it correctly. Hydroxychloroquine. I know the media is dinging them up on this, and you talked a little bit about it earlier on Fox and Friends and some other places. But just so I understand, how comfortable is the president with doing this, and did specifically the doctor prescribe it for him? Just understanding.
Yes, the doctor did prescribe it for him, and he took it after having several discussions with Dr. Connolly about its efficacy, and he believed that Dr. Connolly that the benefits outweighed the risk for the president. And hydroxychloroquine, it's worth mentioning, is a drug that has been approved for at least 3 other conditions. Malaria is one of them as a prophylaxis. I had someone in my office say, "Oh, I've taken this drug several times ahead of me going to trips in places where there were malaria-heavy areas." Lupus is another example. So this is a drug that is out there that has been shown to be safe with these conditions, and it was issued a emergency use authorization to use this as essentially like a right to try. So if you're someone who has this, who's looking for a therapeutic, who has COVID and is looking for a therapeutic, hydroxychloroquine is something some doctors professed optimism about. We know it's approved for other uses, so you do have a right to try it in essence,
right,
to reflect on the language of the president's previous legislation that gives people a right to try in the waning days of their life or when they're facing a fatal illness.
Do you think the media is blowing this out of proportion? You got Neil Cavuto and Joe Scarborough and some others. And China, quite frankly, just called it witchcraft. That the president's doing witchcraft from the Oval Office.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate when you turn on the headlines and turn on the TV in the morning, as I did this morning, watching a certain network, and to hear just complete misinformation about hydroxychloroquine, suggesting that it could be fatal for someone should they take it, and when in fact there are millions of Americans who take it for arthritis, for example. Right. Yes, it should always be something that's prescribed in the context of a doctor-patient. No one should be taking this drug if not prescribed by a doctor. It's very important to say that. Only your doctor can say that this is for you and prescribe it to you, but nevertheless, to completely act as if this is some sort of poison when there are many, many Americans and many people around the world taking this for lupus and other illnesses, it just does more harm than good, that kind of fear-mongering, that kind of misinformation. So it's frustrating to turn it on and to see that, because it ultimately is very damaging.
The criticism would be that the FDA and the government, if you will, the federal government, only recommends that it be taken in a hospital setting. So what's the reaction to that, the pushback about that criticism? So
I talked to Dr. Hahn about that this morning from the FDA, and Dr. Hahn said, first, this is a drug that has a long safety profile. It should always be prescribed from a doctor to a patient, but has been shown to be safe. And I explicitly asked him, what about outside of hospitals? And he said, yes, it's okay if a doctor prescribes it to you in your ordinary point of care. That is an acceptable way to go about this. I think what is being mistaken is the fact that there was a safety notification put out based on a study that was not a clinical study. Right. It was not a VA study either, but it was based on fatalities in the VA. And basically it didn't take into account comorbidities, but it did ask questions about hydroxychloroquine. And they did put out a safety notice, as the FDA regularly does, about studies. But nevertheless, it's still out there. It's still something the FDA stands behind as saying, if you are in a situation where you're prescribed it by your doctor, it is something that you can use and have access to. So, there's a lot of nuances, but those nuances are all too often left out of the coverage.
I want to talk about Obamagate, or as the president says on Twitter, Obamagate with an exclamation point. He is really concerned about what happened to him and his campaign. He's laying a lot of the blame at President Obama's feet. I know you've been asked the question, what is the crime here? I looked back, he did tell Doug Weed, a presidential historian, at one point during Doug Weed's book, that he says, what was done to me was treasonous, is what he said. So is that a sense of the crime, or what's going on here exactly?
Yeah, I think you have to look at this in the context of questions and in the context of things that we know happened. So what we know happened is that Michael Flynn's identity was unmasked, and it was leaked. And it is a criminal offense to leak the identity of an individual like Michael Flynn, a private citizen, to the press after being unmasked. So We know that a crime was committed. Who did it is the question. But there
Within the Obama administration.
Within the Obama administration, absolutely.
Right.
But there are a number of other questions that need to be asked. There's more questions than there are answers in this, and the lack of journalistic curiosity is really something intriguing. But for instance, there was a January 5th Oval Office meeting. President Obama was there, Vice President Biden was there, many others were there. Comey was there, Yates from DOJ, and the Department of Justice, Sally Yates, learned about the unmasking of Michael Flynn from President Obama. How peculiar that the DOJ would be learning about this from the sitting president, not the reverse. How interesting that Jim Comey mentions the Logan Act in that meeting, a statute never used to prosecute an American in its entire 200-year history, but it's brought up in the context of a meeting with President Obama. And then Susan Rice writes about this meeting on the day as she's rushing out of the White House on Inauguration Day, writes about this meeting and says, President Obama wants us to do this, quote, by the book. I mean, there are just so many questions. The DOJ will ultimately provide the answers, the Durham investigation, but I think the president's really trying to point out the questions and how unfortunate it was and unprecedented, to use the words of Attorney General Barr, that a sitting administration would unmask an incoming NSA advisor and leak his identity, and that a dossier funded by the Democrats would be used to spy on members of the Trump campaign.
Do you think the media is carrying the Obama administration's or the former Obama administration's water here to a degree?
When they don't ask the questions, absolutely. Yes, I have seen no coverage. It is just last week, we learned that political appointees, the former vice president, the secretary of treasury, the chief of staff in the Obama administration, were unmasking. These are political individuals. These aren't intel officials.
Right.
Where were the stories about it? When we learned a few weeks before that Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, before investigators from the FBI approached them, they wrote a note pontificating whether they should get him to lie in order to get him fired or prosecuted. Where were the stories about it? They like to cover Michael Flynn when they thought he did something wrong, but when all of a sudden he's being set up and framed and entrapped, there's no coverage, there's no questions, and it's a disservice to the American people.
As we wrap up, I just want to ask you, you've been called a lot of, we talked about this earlier, you've been called a lot of names out there. I mean, they're already saying, I will not lie, and they're calling you a liar already. They're calling you other names, racist and birther and all that type of stuff. What's your response to the critics that say all this stuff to you, about you?
That I know the person I am, and I know what I stand for, and I stand as a Christian woman, someone who believes in equality and truth and loyalty and honesty, and it's the values I've lived by my whole life. It's the values I'll continue to live by, and people will malign you. It comes with the job, but I know who I'm ultimately working for, and it's the big guy upstairs. And my mission in life is that when I pass, he will look at me and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And if I can end my life that way, it doesn't matter what the people say on the way there.
Kayleigh McEnany, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.